Let me say it again. Welcome everybody to Greater Washington's webinar on ETOD, which is called Transit-Oriented Development, but Make It Equitable, how approaches to TOD can be updated to address racial and socioeconomic disparities. I'm very happy that you all could join us today for this exciting conversation that we're about to have. It's been several months in the making. We're really excited about it. Excuse me. But first I wanted to just give a little introduction about who we are as an organization. Greater Washington, or GGWash, is a nonprofit that works in the Washington region on land use, housing, and transportation issues in three main ways: through journalism, education and engagement, and policy and advocacy. And today's work kind of brings together our journalism and engagement work kind of together here. This is my second big webinar that we participate in. I'm very excited about it. So over the past several months, we've been working on a 10-part series unpacking equitable transit-oriented development.
No, you're leaving now, right?
In the region. And basically, we kind of walked into this from the standpoint that we knew the region for decades had been a leader in regards to transit-oriented development and building dense housing and commercial space close to transit stations. And there's plenty of plans to build more around the region. But all too often, we see racial and socioeconomic disparities in not only who can afford to live here, but also who benefits from access to these places. So right now, people are pivoting towards equitable transit-oriented development frameworks to bring more intentionality to address and rectify these disparities. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Just a quick little heads up that we are also recording, just so you're all aware. And before I introduce the panelists, I want to take some time out to thank the Amazon Housing Equity Fund, which gave us the grant to make this work possible. And also all the writers who worked on the series. I will shamelessly drop that whole collection in just a moment. So we're really excited to get started. And I will introduce our panelists now. So first up, we have Cheryl Court, who is the program director for CSG. Excuse me one moment for me. Technical difficulties, sorry about that. She is a policy director, my apologies, for the Coalition for Smarter Growth. She works with community activists, nonprofit groups, and decision makers to promote more walkable, bikeable, and inclusive transit-oriented communities as the most sustainable and equitable way for the DC region to grow and provide opportunities for all. We also have Kyle Reeder, who serves a number of capacities here in the region. He is an organizer with the Capital Market, a Prince George's-based farmers market, and is a trustee stewarding the real property of the congregation of his local faith community in Capitol Heights. And he is also project manager supporting a multidisciplinary team to deliver the planning, acquisition, design, and construction of real estate projects across the the national capital region. He also works with RISE, Prince George's, which is an advocacy group seeking to build a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable future in Prince George's County. And finally, we have Marley Schott, who is the manager of Elevated Chicago, a collaboration of public, private, and civic organizations promoting racially equitable development in Chicago neighborhoods with a focus on transit-oriented development, called ETOD. Under her supervision and leadership, Elevated Chicago has awarded over $2.2 million to organizations promoting racial equity, community development, health, arts and culture, and environmental issues. and she will be here to speak directly about a number of issues regarding ETOD. So without further ado, I would like to get into a little bit of the history of TOD in our region. And I'd like to turn it back over to Cheryl Court, who is the policy director for CSG, to kind of give a little overview of where we are with TOD in the regions and some of the shortcomings that we face when it comes to equity.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Eric. Can you see my screen? Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate you having me. I've been working on these issues for a long time, and excited to be a part of this great panel. In terms of sort of setting a context for the challenges that we face as a region, I think it's really important to recognize the type of region we have is it's a growing region, it's economically strong. We are adding a lot of jobs, and with those jobs come people who want to get those jobs. And so we have strong demand to live here, strong demand for housing. And the Council of Government projects that based on job growth, we're going to need about 320,000 more housing units by 2023. And that in terms of the pace of providing that housing, we're looking at about a 75,000 unit shortfall. And so that's sort of the backdrop for how we look at opportunities to be guiding growth to the right places so that we can connect people to better resources, better opportunities. And obviously with this kind of strong growth, and when you have you're looking at a housing shortfall, you're going to be looking at competition for a limited housing stock, which is obviously going to pressure housing prices and push out and disadvantage people who are and exacerbate existing inequities, basically. So that's sort of like our challenging context. Going sort of back a little bit, I apologize for not having a regional map. I really wish I had a regional map, but sort of like broadly, the core of the region, the District of Columbia, Arlington, and Alexandria, in the suburbanization, the post-war suburbanization period, all lost jobs and housing to outer suburbs. And here, actually, I just pulled up some maps from DC. You can see the one that's orange shows most of the map is orange, showing loss of population in the 1980s and 1990s. But then you look at the green map, that shows growth in the city through most of the city, people coming back to the city. And then figure 2.2, where we're looking at a chart, it looks at population by race in the city. And if you look at the peak of that, that's about 1950, when DC probably had the most residents, somewhere around 800,000 residents. But right after that, you see a steep decline in the white population. Now that's the post-war period when the federal government got really involved with subsidizing white people, basically to get mortgages, to build highways to their suburban subdivisions, and all manner of assistance. Basically, it was quite explicitly or implicitly guided to white people and not to people of color. And so you do see some decline in you see a steep decline in white population. You see modest declines in the African-American population during this period. And much later, in about the 1970s, African-Americans were given more opportunity to move to the suburbs, given more access to mortgage loans, and allowed into communities that had hostily excluded them from previously. And you see sort of the white population sort of bottoming out and still kind of declining until about 2000. And then sort of white young people rediscover the city. They start flocking to the city. There's very rapid growth from 2000 to 2010. And the white population has continued to grow. The African-American population arrested its steep decline, but in the 2020 census has still showed some decline. And this leads us to sort of a look back at the last 2 decades. And the University of Minnesota has done these very nice analyses looking at neighborhood change. And they've done them for all over the country for metropolitan regions, including DC. And you can see from this, there's sort of 3 main colors on this map. Well, there's the white part, which is sort of like no real change. There's the blue, which is basically where we see economic expansion and displacement. There is the pink, which is where we see concentration of low-income households and the loss of, say, higher income households. And then the green. And the green is very interesting because the green is what they're calling inclusive growth, which is where there are higher income households moving into these census tracts, but at the same time, we're not actually seeing the loss of lower income households. Now, obviously, we wish the entire region were green, and it's not, but it's interesting to investigate sort of what might be the characteristics of those areas. But I first want to check in on how people of color are doing with this last 20 years. And as you can see, the middle chart shows that the African-American residents are bearing the brunt of economic expansion in these places that show displacement. So African Americans were strongly displaced in growing areas that basically white people were flocking to. Whites were leaving economic declining areas. They were flocking to areas that are growing economically. And interestingly enough, Latinos as an ethnic group are represented actually as growing in each of these different types of areas, both declining and expanding areas. I just wanted to do one last sort of drill down is about these interesting green areas. So this, and now I want to say that this analysis was started by University of Maryland or University of Minnesota, and using that methodology, Montgomery County Planning Department has done some further analysis that really focuses on Montgomery County, but actually includes the whole region. So it's useful for all of us to look at. And this shows downtown Silver Spring as the strongest green area actually on the entire map. And what it shows is that there's tremendous amount of increase in housing in downtown Silver Spring during the last 20 years. And the analysis by Montgomery County sort of is correlating strong growth in new housing with attenuating a displacement of low-income households from the census tract. So that was it's sort of an interesting result and something that I think merits more investigation. But that's sort of my introductory remarks. George, if you want to, I'll stop sharing my screen and can move on to the next part of the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I think before we kind of get started into like best practices, I would love to kind of take the time before we get to numbers and statistics and define what it means to actually, for TOD to actually be equitable. I would love to hear from each one of the panels about how you define what that means. And Cheryl, maybe we can start with you and then move to Marley and Kyle.
Yeah, well, we want to ensure that that we're creating access to jobs and opportunity and services for every member of our community, regardless of where they come from, their race. Someone's circumstances should not be a predictor for their life chances to access higher education, higher incomes, good jobs. And so transformative development is the idea that we're going to create more of those housing opportunities close to high quality transit that allows people to be able to walk, bicycle, and take transit to access opportunity locally and throughout the region.
That makes a lot of sense. And Marley, what is your definition of what it means for TOD to be equitable?
Sure. So for us, it really means that everyone has the opportunity to live in thriving communities, no matter the demographics or, the situation, the geographic location of the community within the city. And so that means that we really intentionally emphasize that TOD is community driven. It addresses the needs and the wants of the existing community and protects legacy community, and invites new people in rather than displacing, but also does not displace legacy residents from their community and amplifies their culture and history there.
Thank you so much. And Kyle, did you want to take that question?
Yeah. Kind of piggyback off of Cheryl and Marley. For me, equity is promoting justice, impartiality, fairness, and within the way we do things and how our institutions distribute resources. And so if that is kind of defining equity, I would define, I guess, equitable transit-oriented development as something that not only promotes smart growth in our around our transit centers, but also development that rectifies policies and around transportation, housing, zoning that have promoted inequality, that have created barriers to opportunity, and that have diminished the quality of life for marginalized communities. So that's what, to me, equitable transit-oriented development looks like.
That's very fair. And for those in the chat, I'm definitely going to get to your questions when we get to the Q&A period. For questions specifically for people, I'll definitely direct the panelists to perhaps answer some of those questions that were asked of panelists directly. Thank you again, Kyle. I want to pivot over to Marley Schott, the manager of Elevated Chicago, to talk a little bit about what Chicago has been doing. They seem to have had some pretty concrete accomplishments when it comes to centering equity in transit-oriented development. So Marley, would you like to talk about that and what you've seen in your city?
Sure, I would love to. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining us. So let me share my screen. Elevated Chicago, I just want to talk really briefly about, what we are. Elevated Chicago is a coalition of public and private organizations, civic institutions, from the regional, citywide to community level. And we basically have come together to advance ETOD as a tool for addressing many of the issues that not just the city of Chicago are facing, including displacement and gentrification, but that we're seeing nationally. And we have been able to really kind of amplify ETOD as a tool at the national level, because we are part of a national initiative called the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge. So that has given us the platform to lift our local message to share that nationally. And it's been an amazing opportunity. And it really has given us kind of a launching pad for considerable growth and accomplishment in this area within the city of Chicago. I won't talk a lot about what ETOD is, because I'm sure some of you have been on all of the webinars in this series, but basically the intention of TOD is to create medium density, mixed use communities that are walkable, that are safe for active transportation, and that provide economic benefits because amenities and assets are within the community. But here in Chicago, this is just kind of a snapshot of what we've seen taken place. The initial TOD ordinance passed in 2013, and we had hoped that it would inspire and drive investment across the city. Many of you may know or may not that Chicago is called, it's like the tale of two cities, right? Our north side and northwest side are predominantly white and predominantly more affluent. And our south and west sides are predominantly communities of color. And so what we saw through the initial TOD ordinance was that it did in fact spur development, but it spurred development where development was not necessarily needed. And it also spurred development, particularly on the north side, that caused gentrification and displacement of some of our particularly Latinx residents. And so 90% of the projects that came out of this ordinance that benefited from this ordinance took place on the north and northwest sides of the city. And here's some examples of what we have seen with TOD. When we have seen it, it is not equitable. It tends to be luxury, or when there are TOD investments in disinvested communities, there tends to be no planning around those projects. So they really don't create any economic benefits for the community. And so here on the left, you can see this is our 95th Red Line station. It is currently the end of the Red Line, which is the longest transit CTA line in the city. And it did have a $300 million station built there, a new station, because it is a transit hub. But if you look around that, the aerial picture, there is not a lot of investment happening around that. There's one block that is 8 vacant lots. There was no planning done around this investment to spur and move people outside of that transit station so that the community could actually benefit from all of the people that were passing through. And on our right side here, we see this is our Logan Square community, which has been for decades and historically a Latinx community that had a thriving commercial corridor. And as you can see, what we're seeing in that community is luxury TOD, which is displacing our legacy families. And we are seeing a loss of Latinx population. I'll talk about that in just a second. So we're seeing these two sides of displacement in Chicago, and this is by no means just caused by TOD, but TOD has been a driver previously since the ordinance. And so between 2000 and 2019, the Logan Square community has seen almost a 47% decrease in its Latinx population. And that is due to gentrification and rising market prices. And on the other side of this coin, between 2000 and 2019, Chicago, the city of Chicago has lost almost 300,000 Black residents, primarily from its South Side communities. And when we are able to track reasons that people have left, which is difficult to do, generally it is because they're searching for more thriving communities. They're searching for amenities and assets and safety, and they don't want to live in a community that's been disinvested for decades. And so we see ETOD as the tool to solve these very challenging issues, and also many other intersectional issues such as climate resilience, cultural vitality, and public health. And so I saw, Cheryl, you and I have the same definition for equitable transit-oriented development. It does advocate that people of all incomes experience the benefits of dense mixed-use pedestrian-oriented development near transit hubs, and Chicago has an amazing transit system. But for some communities, it's not seen as an asset because it remains very disconnected from the community, and it's not seen as a safe and accessible place. And so our mission was to, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been working on advancing ETOD, not only through community channels and public perception, but also at the government and systems level. And so we, one of what we think is our best practices is really investing in marketing and communications that speak to various audiences in different ways, that provide educational tools that are engaging and exciting. And we consider this is a brochure that we consider a piece of art. We commissioned a local artist and a graphic designer to put this together. And it really just kind of outlines what we think ETOD looks like. And ETOD can look like a lot of different things to us. It's not just affordable housing or just economic opportunity, but it's community vibrancy as well. And so Elevated Chicago itself is, as I said, we have 16 members from the institutional, civic and governmental level, through the community-based level. All of our community-based partners serve and or are led by people of color. And the unique thing about Elevated Chicago that really helps us embed equity in our practices is that even though we have a broad spectrum of partners, the power dynamics have been removed from the table. Everyone who sits at the table has one vote. And, you know, it's been really interesting and challenging to bring together communities that haven't worked together or have often been in competition for what they've been told are limited resources. But it also, we have funders and philanthropy sitting at the same table as the community-based organizations that they fund. And we were very intentional in telling our funders, if you are sitting at our table, you are a partner, you're not a funder, because we want to encourage our community-based partners to share issues, to discuss barriers and challenges, so that this space can not only be used for advocacy and advancing ETOD, but for shared learning and thought partnership. And so this is where we started, around 7 transit stations across the city of Chicago, representing particularly Black and Latinx communities. And this is where we are now. And so on the right, you'll see again the map that I showed earlier with the ETOD that Chicago had seen prior to 2019. And now just over the last 5 years, through our partnerships, our advocacy, our partnership with the city of Chicago, and really the tireless work of all of our community and regional partners, we see a much more diverse and dispersed pipeline of projects. And some of these are Elevated Chicago projects. Elevated Chicago also partnered with the city to launch some ETOD pilot projects. And recently the Department of Housing committed $800 million of ARPA funding, specifically to ETOD. And that's either the rehabilitation and revitalization of existing affordable housing or new affordable housing specifically centered around transit, which is actually unprecedented in Chicago. So we're really excited about that. And so I just want to quickly share a couple of examples of the way that Elevated Chicago thinks about TOD before I delve a little deeper into the systems work. We divide our work plan up into 3 buckets: people, place, and process. And below those, you can see the different ways in which we advance our work in those areas. And our work is lifted up by primarily our community partners. We do fund our community partners to sit at our table and to advance collaboration within their communities, and to amplify and lift up to us the work that they would like Elevated Chicago to be a partner on, whether that's through technical assistance, financial resources, again, or thought partnership, network access, whatever it might be. And so our people-based work really focuses on narrative change and changing the narrators themselves, amplifying stories that come from the community as told by the community themselves, building resident power and organizing. We have a program called the Equitable Development Ambassadors Program, which is a resident-based program that provides education on the legacy of racist practices and policies that have driven real estate and have really contributed to the segregation that we experience in our city today and continue to impact our housing market. It also gives participants the more technical skills to start visioning and developing their own projects for their community. And we also are currently actively exploring various community ownership models. That is a new model in Chicago. We did seed one of our partners, the first community land trust in the city. And so that's incredibly exciting. And we also support our partners in working with the city and developers to advance community benefits agreements so that communities can benefit in some way or another from developments coming into their communities that they may have had no say or power in. And our place-based work, we have 3 types of interventions: our bricks and mortar, our green infrastructure, and our walkability and cultural activation. And I'm just going to go through these really quickly, but I do just want to show the diversity of what ETOD can look like. We have community centers, we have medium density, mixed use housing and commercial developments. We have 100% affordable housing developments, business incubators. It also looks like green infrastructure projects. This is something that we have primarily invested in small scale projects to start demonstrating the value of green infrastructure in communities of color. We have heard from our partners and through many, many conversations that residents are resistant often to green infrastructure and arts and culture investments because they are seen as drivers of gentrification. And so we have started with small investments such as beautification of vacant lots, reforesting. One of the larger projects is an eco orchard. The community that this exists in is a food desert, and the residents wanted a fruit orchard. So this is a fruit and nut orchard that has been developed or is in development in partnership with the city, but it is also a stormwater management intervention that will filter 250,000 gallons of stormwater beneath the orchard over the course of a year. And some of the most pressing climate issues in Chicago are heat islands, rising temperatures, and flooding. And then walkability and activation. We will look at walkability from a very holistic perspective. It's not just getting from point A to B, but it's what that journey from point A to B feels like, what it makes you feel like. Do you feel safe? Do you feel connected to your community? Do you feel like you can access the things that you need? Does it inspire you? All of those things we include in walkability in addition to just the infrastructure conversations. And then what I'm going to focus a little more on is our process-based work. And here are just some of the examples of the process-based work that we have committed to and contributed to and led or partnered with over the last few years. And we really see ourselves working across the full spectrum, right? From community-based to the systems change level, from the individual to reaching the systems change level. And so some of the work that we have been really pretty successful in, actually, we are really proud of this work, is in 2019, Elevated Chicago did partner, well, really starting in 2017, Elevated Chicago partnered with the mayor's office to put together a new TOD ordinance and to put together an ordinance that was more focused on equity. And in addition to that, to accompany that and as an accountability measure for the city, it required the development of an equitable implementation plan. And so once that 2019 ordinance was approved, we went to work. We put together a work group of 40 plus organizations, again, from community level all the way through government. Also included all of our regional transit agencies, private developers, nonprofit developers, and that working group met monthly and put together a plan to support the city in equitable implementation of its TOD ordinance. We also hosted quarterly larger workshops that included 100 to 200 participants to provide input on the direction of our plan. And so in 2021, the city, we had a public comment period, a 45-day public comment period. The equitable implementation plan was translated into 6 languages. And we also led kind of a campaign across all of our community partners and all our civic institutions to host kind of family and friends sessions to spread the word. We were able to virtually, unfortunately still, but we were able to directly virtually connect with over 500 individuals. We had over 1,500 downloads of the implementation plan. We received 60 comments. But also directly through the webpage feedback, but also through received multiple comments, hundreds of comments through various other channels, such as our meetings and other informational sessions. And so these were the highlights of the plan: to build the city's capacity to support ETOD, to make it easier, to make it required and more equitable, and to embed ETOD as a practice into the city's planning process. The city is embarking currently on the first citywide plan in over 60 years. So we do want to make sure that ETOD is a considerable part of the future of the city and a part of this plan. And so what I'm going to focus, though, a little bit more on today is the making ETOD required easier and more equitable. One of the recommendations that we made to the city was an overlay zoning district. And so once we, oh, sorry, I didn't realize it said animations. Once we got the policy plan, the implementation plan approved, the first step really was to look at where can we make the fastest changes? What can we do to kind of really spur ETOD as a tool across the city? And so we looked at our zoning code, and our prior zoning code had many challenges, many barriers. It created many barriers. One of which included that there in many of our communities, also all those communities along these transit lines that you see circled, it is 2 to 3 flats or medium density developments are banned. They only allow for single family homes, which around rapid transit nodes does not make a lot of sense. We see it as a very exclusionary tactic. And the 2 to 3 flats in Chicago is really a very traditional and prevalent type of housing, and we call it our naturally affordable housing stock. And we are seeing not only a loss of that, but because of bans such as these, we don't see expansion of those medium and small density affordable housing. A lot of our transit areas allow for specifically auto-oriented development, such as, commercial retail, body shops, gas stations, things that require a lot of curb cuts and that attract a lot of vehicles to heavily pedestrianized and active transportation areas. And so, this was kind of the basis of us starting with the zoning code. And as we moved into this process, it was something that I have never experienced before. We really came up, of course, against a lot of resistance. Much of the resistance was from our own political system here. Many of our alder persons, we have 50 alder people who are the governmental representative within the community areas, just didn't want to take this on. They were either it's considered too risky, or it's considered, for a lot of our communities, they don't want changes to the zoning code because it allows them to control who has access to their communities. It's also a really obscure topic that people don't know about and don't care about, but also part of our work over these last few years has been to educate people on the need for these types of changes in order to remove a lot of those barriers. Political inertia is prevalent, right? Nobody wants to take on issues that are scary, particularly as we enter an election season. Many of our conversations did become contentious, and we have to deal constantly with NIMBYism, not in my backyard, right? People who say, oh, this doesn't fit the character of the community. There's not enough parking. And a lot of these are veiled excuses, and a lot of them are just misinformation. And so a big part of our work, again, was that educational campaign. And so we ultimately came up with an ordinance that had 3 specific goals. And under each of these, it outlines some of the supporting deeper context that will be applied to achieve these goals. But around our transit stations, our goals are to grow the economy, right? To allow more homes and businesses, to make the streets safer, not just for pedestrians, but all active types of transportation, and all residents and community stakeholders who move throughout these areas, who live, work, and play. And to encourage more diverse and affordable housing in every neighborhood. And so a couple of the things I do want to highlight here is we did have to lose some of the more progressive elements of the ordinance, unfortunately. I have learned that's a political strategy that is just necessary. And one of the things that we did have to lose was removing that ban on 2 to 3 flats, but we are committed to continuing advocacy around that. But we were able to expand TOD zones to a half mile, which is the federal standard. Chicago did not apply that at standard. And we also were able to expand the benefits of TOD to all of our high frequency bus lines, which is amazing because many of our communities don't have transit or don't have rail access. And so this allows the benefits of TOD to reach communities that need it, that did not have that entree previously. Another thing that is really exciting, depending on who you ask, one of the challenges of Chicago politics is the prerogative, what we call our aldermanic prerogative. And aldermen and women have the power to really control what happens in their communities, often to the benefit of the community, but many times to the detriment as well. And we found that in many communities, particularly our high income communities, affordable housing developments continue to get pushed aside, continue to get moved to the bottom of the pile, until ultimately developers would just walk away from the project, because the reality was that the alderperson didn't want the project in their community. But rather than just saying it, they would just delay the vote. And one of the major pieces of this ordinance is that we do now require up or down zoning committee votes on affordable developments within 1 year of introduction of the project. And so that really pushes alder people to make the case either for or against. If you're opting not to include ETOD or affordable housing in your community, you need to state that and take your position and defend your position so that we can respond appropriately. So these are just a few examples. And so once we were able, we did, after months and months of advocacy, meeting with alder people, meeting with community groups, we were able to pass the ordinance through City Council this July. Again, we did have to make some concessions, but we have committed to continuing to work on building this. And our next steps really are to continue that outreach and education, and really that's to help communities understand the value of TOD, ETOD, and the power of it as a tool in their community, and to be more actively engaged in the development of their community, to develop tracking and evaluation mechanisms with the city. We are a thought partner to the city, but we are also their accountability buddy. And so this allows us to have, through the ETOD working group, to have a say and to drive how the city evaluates this ordinance and holds itself accountable to the commitments and recommendations that it made in the equitable implementation plan. And then one of the pieces was that larger developers develop transportation demand management plans for their developments. And so building out what that looks like and what the requirements of that would be to meet the TOD, to receive TOD benefits. This is the kind of the next steps ongoing for the next few years. We have 11 pilot projects that we're testing various ideas and strategies and funding those partners to do so. And so now we're really just looking at how do we now, we've got this ordinance, we've got this implementation plan in place. And so how do we hold true to the promises that we've made based on the work that we've put together and done together? And so now we are just continuing the work of the ETOD working group and continuing to support our ETOD pilots and continuing to educate and connect with residents and stakeholders to advance ETOD.
Wow, thank you, Marley. That was really amazing just to see all the work that has to go in to make ETOD possible. And I know this isn't an apples for apples comparison. Chicago is a different city than the Washington region. But Cheryl, I would love to hear from you, having heard the story of Chicago, where do you think the region stands in comparison? How does it compare, contrast? I'm sure there's some similarities to talk about when it comes to zoning challenges. So I'd love to hear from you around how the region compares.
Yeah, certainly we've been through a lot of battles on zoning and land use plans in the district. We face a lot of resistance to building affordable housing and mixed income housing. And we are always looking for tools that could both have a good public process, a robust public process, but not create we have sort of a situation where it just takes one unhappy homeowner living nearby to hang up an affordable housing project for years into the courts. And that is a huge challenge. And so it doesn't matter how much outreach is done and how much engagement is done by Office of Planning, by the developer. All it takes is one person to file an appeal to that project. And so that's a big barrier that we worked on through our comprehensive plan. We think we actually have reduced, we just passed our comprehensive plan update. We think we've reduced some of the framing around, how much that will be stalling affordable housing, but it's still a big issue. And we're looking for, I'd be interested in looking at the tool that you use in terms of your rezoning process, how you change the rezoning process, because we want to make sure that we're giving the right amount of process. Like, we believe in process, but not kind of empowering someone who can just block it, and that the delay becomes the block, basically, because ultimately a lot of these projects are going to go forward. And, the rezoning thing really works both ways, I'll say. We struggled with a really important update in Prince George's County to their antiquated zoning code that is much more walk-friendly, reduced parking around transit stations. It has a lot of good urban design elements to it, but we were not successful in convincing Prince George's to not upzone some garden apartments with a lot of moderate and low income, largely immigrant households living near future Purple Line stations in Langley Park. We said, why don't your own plan says you should wait and make sure that you have some better displacement prevention measures in place before you do that upzoning. We think that ultimately it should be upzoned, but not until we have those protections. But I will actually say, to Prince George's credit, they have actually marched right along with their right of first refusal and went and have actually worked with effective partners to purchase some of the most significant apartment buildings in that area, to upgrade them and put them under permanent affordability, or long-term affordability. So in fact, my greatest fears have not yet materialized, but there's still a lot more work to be done on places like the Purple Line, our new a light rail line and the inner suburbs, which offer great access on one hand, but we need to make sure that I see Prince George's stepping up to provide more resources and effectively use tools like first right of refusal. But we struggle. I just want to say that what I was really excited about, what Marley talked about, was building up community institutions and community partnerships to be much more engaged in the process, and that's something that I think is done. That's sort of the less of the public policy piece of it and more of the how do we actually make sure that we're strengthening local community groups and have basically more partners to work with, so that we can make better community decisions about how to shape the future of these places.
Thank you, Cheryl. And Kyle, I would love to hear from you, also staying in Prince George's for a bit, that you work with Rise Prince George's, and with the community. What are some of the challenges you see when it comes to having the community more involved in making sure that they have a seat at the table? And what has been your experience in trying to push for ETOD in Prince George's and where you work?
Can you hear me? Oh, cool. So I definitely want to answer your question, George, but I did just want to kind of pull out some points that in Marley's presentation that kind of resonated with me, particularly the tale of two cities in Chicago, and in terms of as the city was pivoting to more transit-oriented development, they saw a lot of those resources and energy kind of being focused on more wider and affluent communities in the north, as opposed to communities that really could use and really benefit from the development in the south side of the city. And for folks in our region, particularly in the DC region, I know Cheryl had the map of the DC area or the DC proper, but if folks know that it's almost kind of a similar acclimate here, right? Where it's like you have west of the river, east of the river, and folks living in 2 different cities here in DC. And so a lot of that has kind of spilled over into Prince George's County, right, where it is a majority minority county. A lot of resources that otherwise would have, or a lot of resources don't necessarily come into the county before the simple fact that it is a majority minority county, right? And so part of the goals of this our county executive, Angela Alsobrooks, and as she came into office and into power, was to support the production of 26,000 new residential units, which 75% of them will remain affordable. She also has a goal of preserving 6,000 affordable residential units. And as Cheryl mentioned, as more development and transit-oriented development specifically is coming to Prince George's County, and we see things like the Purple Line, and now the new focus on the Blue Line corridor. Having the tools to be able to preserve affordability, so that the displacement that we saw in DC and that Cheryl mentioned earlier in her presentation, where a lot of DC residents or long-time DC residents were pushed out and pushed farther into more suburban and places that don't have the same type of access to transit and jobs, and ultimately hinder their opportunities to be able to grow and develop. And so, as Cheryl mentioned, there are a couple of tools that the county has are putting in place and has put in place to kind of mitigate the coming challenges that we saw kind of transpire in DC with, like I said, the right of first refusal, and we have $15 million dedicated towards that, or the Housing Trust Fund, which there's now dedicated funding for about $100 million. And going back to your question, George, of just kind of some of the things that we're seeing in the county, specifically, there are a lot of engaged folks around this issue with the Purple Line. There was a housing group that was dedicated to trying to figure out tools and mechanisms to be able to, like I said, ensure that as this county grows, with the region, that folks are able to participate in this process. And I really think it's about uplifting the folks that are already kind of doing this work. We operate a farmers market that's literally right by the train station, and being able to kind of highlight those community assets in a way that where Prince George's County has to figure out, hey, how do we grow our tax base while still preserving the affordability and making sure that the development is inclusive. So just working with the right partners, using the right tools, and having a good vision, which I believe that our county executive has set forth in her economic development plan.
Thank you, Kyle. And we have a few questions from our participants in the webinar, but I just wanted to ask one quick question, expanding on some of those successful tools that are working in Prince George's. Cheryl, could you talk to maybe some of the other tools that are also working throughout the region as well, maybe in Arlington and other spaces, east of the river, other spaces, besides rights of refusal and other things that could be working that we may want to double down on?
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, just at its base, we need energetic governments to be utilizing all of the federal and maybe state resources that they have available to them. A lot of governments leave a lot on the table, basically. And so not only do we need more local investment, like dedicated local housing trust funds, but those are usually set up because the government's getting smarter about leveraging things like low-income housing tax credits. There are sort of almost unlimited low-income housing tax credits that are well utilized in some jurisdictions and not in others. And so that's something I've seen a positive change in Prince George's on that, as it's become more welcoming of affordable housing investments. And so just kind of using what you already have that is available to you, and then also needing to look to local resources to put into an affordable housing trust fund. Actually, Prince George's just last year put in $10 million for the made a commitment of an annual commitment of at least $10 million a year. DC, made a commitment of $100 million a couple years ago, and now is at like with a lot of federal money at this point, like the over $400 million. But Montgomery, Arlington has always been good on trust fund, and so we need to sort of build all of these tools. And we'd like to see Fairfax doing more on this, which is our wealthy and largest jurisdiction in the region. And then, other tools like the strong market tool, like inclusionary zoning, which is where you set aside some affordable units in a larger market rate project, and usually provide a cost offset with allowing the developer to build some additional units. Montgomery pioneered this and has actually taken it to the next level, where they now have a 15% set aside of affordable units for affluent areas and areas around transit. And so they've really kind of continued to strengthen that policy. And DC also has recently taken their inclusionary zoning policy, which they adopted, started operating about 2009, 2011. And now have what they call IZ Plus, which is in an upzoning, which is a good follow-on to the comprehensive plan, where we rewrote some of the, increased some of the land use designations on our future land use map, that when you do the upzone, you increase the amount of housing you can put on that site, that you would actually owe a larger set aside of affordable units on that site. And so those are we got to make sure that all works. It's new. And so we're still kind of working through that. But those are some of the kind of basic tools. And I just want to give a shout out to HAND, our regional housing, affordable housing developer association, which has done a wonderful thing called the housing indicators tool, where they're actually evaluating and tracking each of our jurisdictions on adopting best practices from trust fund and inclusionary zoning, and then tracking housing commitments. How far are they hitting their mark in terms of income targeting and production? And so I just want to note that HAND's housing indicators tool is actually a great resource for if you're really interested in what Fairfax County is doing, or what Prince William is doing. This is a great resource for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And we do have a few questions from our participants I definitely wanted to get to. One question was, how can CAVs, connected and automated vehicles, policies integrate with ETOD plans and strategies? I would love for maybe Marley, and then Cheryl, and then Kyle to answer that, maybe in a minute or two.
I would actually defer to Cheryl on that. I think that I don't have the technical expertise for that, but also, Chicago is really struggling right now with more active forms of transit. Our biking, the prevalence of bicyclists and e-scooters and all types, manners of personal transportation devices. And while we are starting to talk about automated vehicles, they are really very, very distant from the center of the conversation right now.
Yeah, I would have a similar experience that these AVs might play a role in transit, but the fact is that we still have the same geometry of our streets, and how are we going to make them be efficient and help the parts of our community? And that's really by creating great walkable places with high quality transit and a great bike network.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Prince George's County is a suburban county, and though a lot of folks are in this moment car dependent, we would like to see just more folks using the transportation options that are already available. We're very strong and rich in transit options with the train and the bus, and with it being underdeveloped, we want to push more housing towards there and getting people out of single-use vehicles anyway.
It makes a lot of sense. And unfortunately, we are running out of time. There are a couple other questions that were directed to panelists. I see that panelists are actually answering. We will actually get a lot of those questions that were directed to individual panelists. We'll make sure that they are answered. I just wanted to take this moment to thank our panelists, Cheryl Port, Marley Schott, and Kyle Reeder for participating in today's webinar. I think it was a robust conversation. I really appreciate you. Another thank you to Amazon Housing Equity Fund for giving us the grant to make this work possible. All our writers on the series, and everyone at GG Watch and our larger community that has helped to kind of foster this conversation, and we can't wait for the next one. Thank you so much for everyone for participating. And we will record this and send that out to you shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, George.